In this video, I'd like to share with you the true story of Cinderella. You see, I don't think people normally tell us the true story of Cinderella. We all know that she was horribly treated by her stepsisters and her stepmother, and she married the prince and they all lived happily ever after. But you see, I don't think it went quite like that. Cinderella undoubtedly did have a hard time. She lost her mother when she was young, and her father lost no time in finding himself a rather unpleasant second wife with two perfectly horrible daughters, and they were mean to Cinderella. But Cinderella was in denial. She loved her dear old dad, and she never said to herself, well, actually, he owes me a little bit more consideration than he's showing me. He's blind to my needs. That's not good enough. I need to bring this to his attention. She just said, oh, Daddy's wonderful. And she was a terrible people pleaser. She thought that if she did enough for the ugly sisters and her stepmother, they might come to like her. She thought she could make people like her by doing things for them. And what happened with Cinderella was she became a drudge. And she became a bit of a self-pitying drudge. And she'd sit by the fire and say, this is my life, this is what's going to happen to me, this is all I can look forward to, I'm so unfortunate. Now this went on until the prince of the realm found that his biological clock was ticking, and he decided to take a wife. And he asked for all the aristocratic young ladies of the kingdom to come to a ball. Cinderella's stepsisters qualified as aristocratic whether or not they were, because her father was an impoverished aristocrat, so they were invited, and Cinderella, in this selfless people-pleasing way of hers, helped them get ready for the ball and saw them off, and then sat there thinking, oh, everybody has something good going on for them except me. And then Cinderella people pleaser had a stroke of luck that most people don't. She had a fairy godmother. Most people just aren't that lucky. So the fairy godmother appears out of nowhere in a flash of light, looks at Cinderella quietly snivelling by the fire and says, Cinderella, you shall go to the ball. She waves her magic wand and creates this wonderful ball gown, creates a beautiful carriage, and she gives Cinderella a piece of advice which was pure gold. You must leave by 12 o'clock. Now this was for technological reasons, as I understand it, because the magic didn't work after 12, but it couldn't have been more of a gift to Cinderella. And we'll see why. So Cinderella turns up at the ball late, which was already pretty impressive, because all the nubile aristocratic young ladies of the realm were there in good time because they desperately wanted to bag the prince. She arrives late, so she gets his attention. She makes a grand entrance. Then she knows she has to leave at 12, and she also knows that she can't be honest about who she really is. She knows that when she gets to dance with the prince and he rushes over to her to dance with her, she knows that she can't say, actually, I'm Cinderella, you know, my stepsisters are here and I was left at home because they treat me like a drudge, and I come from a family that doesn't have much money and it's really hard for me, and I spend my time cooking and cleaning and looking after them. So she can't talk about herself. So she's mysterious. She's mysterious. The prince loves it, because for him that means the dream personified. Not only is she beautiful, but she's a challenge to him. He has to think about who she is. Had Cinderella been left to her own devices, She would have let him know what a lovely person she was. She'd have let him know how much she cared for people and small animals, how much she wanted to make a difference in the world, how she loved her grandmother and her father, and she would probably have bored him witless. But she couldn't do that. And on the stroke of midnight, she had to run away, leaving behind a single shoe. Happily, she had a small foot. Had she had a huge foot and worn a boat on it, he might not have been so interested. But there it was. The prince had been faced with a fantasy and a mystery, and he wanted to track her down. So then followed a few interesting days or weeks as the prince went round the kingdom looking at all the aristocratic young women to see which one could fit into Cinderella's shoe and match his fantasy. He must have seen some pretty unpleasant goings-on along the way and learned quite a lot about the darker side of aristocratic young ladies by the time he eventually came to Cinderella's ramshackle abode. And there the two stepsisters, who would stop at nothing to bag their prince, were quite happy to try and hack off a toe or a heel in order to get into the shoe. And eventually, purely by chance, this ragged, cinder-dirtied person was allowed to try the shoe, and it fitted. And can you imagine what that did for the prince? Because now he could do something that really interested him. Now he could rescue his beautiful mystery woman. And let's face it, the prince was a bit shallow. He wanted someone beautiful, he wanted the fantasy, and he wanted the ego boost of rescue. A lot of men do. Tends not to turn out well, but it does make them feel good at the time. So the prince rescued his Cinderella and swept her off on a white horse to his kingdom, where he swiftly married her. And then reality set in. First, he realised that he had the in-laws from hell. They were vulgar, they were brash, they were ill-mannered, they were frightful, and they were his in-laws. And Cinderella, I'm a lovely person, Cinderella, was supremely loyal to them. The next thing that happened was that he found his mystery Cinderella was actually supremely biddable. She was such a nice girl. She was so nice that she wanted to do everything she possibly could to please him. And that made her very biddable. It wasn't too long before the prince, who was very used to having servants, would say to her, "Hey, Cinderella, would you mind getting that cup off the table for me, please?" "Of course I will, darling." "Hey, Cinderella, would you mind just telling the servants that I want this done at such and such a time?" "Of course I will, darling." "Cinderella, would you mind just telling the minister that I can't see him at the moment because I'm having a nice cup of tea?" "Of course I will, darling." And the prince got a bit bored. So he started spending a bit more time out, but he still had a relationship with Cinderella, and in the fullness of time they had a couple of children, and Cinderella was as pleased as Punch because now her world was complete. And she did what a lot of women do. She made her children the centre of the world, and she did everything for them. She loved them so much. And it wasn't long before the two children started ordering her around, as did the prince, as did the courtiers and the ministers and the palace servants. And the prince, meanwhile, was getting more and more bored, and he started chasing after his fantasy woman. And Cinderella was doing more and more round the palace for everyone. And the way it ended was she became a drudge round the palace. People used to see her, and she'd be working her socks off, helping the servants or doing things for the kids, and they forgot that she was a queen. And Cinderella went back to thinking, it's really hard for me. I love people and I do so much for them, and they still don't appreciate me. She didn't know that you have to train people to appreciate you if you want to be appreciated. Don't let what happened to Cinderella happen to you.